Okay, let's jump right into this documentary-style explainer of one of the absolute most chilling cases in American history. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the dark psychology, the agonizing timeline, and the incredible scientific breakthroughs that finally brought Gary Ridgway to justice. We are talking about a monster hiding right in plain sight, and how the evolution of forensic science ultimately ended his reign of terror.
Now, 48 to 71. What's truly terrifying about these numbers is the sheer scale of the devastation. While Gary Ridgway was officially convicted of 48 murders, he actually confessed to killing more than 70 women. That staggering body count literally makes him the most prolific serial killer in United States history.
So, that brings us to the central question of this entire explainer. How exactly does a man responsible for such unimaginable carnage evade the largest, most expensive murder investigation in the country for almost 2 decades? Seriously, how does someone commit dozens of murders and then just clock in at work the next day?
Part 1. The Green River Terror. The grim reality of 1982 is captured perfectly in the official prosecutor's summary. It states that beginning in 1982, dozens of young women in King County simply disappeared. The targets were almost entirely vulnerable women, mostly sex workers and runaways. Because they were on the fringes of society, their disappearances initially flew completely under the radar, which allowed the killer to build this terrifying momentum before the community even realized what was happening.
The horror really took physical shape on July 15, 1982. That's when the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield was pulled from the Green River. Fast forward just 1 month to August, and 4 more bodies were discovered in and around the water. Because of this specific dumping ground, the press quickly dubbed this unseen predator the Green River Killer, and King County launched a massive task force that would end up costing millions of dollars. But here is the craziest part. Ridgway actually became a suspect as early as 1983. He drove a truck similar to one a victim was seen entering, and he lived right nearby. Yet, somehow, he completely eluded arrest.
Part 2. Mind of a Predator.
If we rewind and look at Ridgway's youth, the warning signs were flashing bright red. Even though he had no formal juvenile record, he exhibited the classic triad of sociopathy. We're talking bedwetting well into his teens, juvenile arson, and absolutely horrifying animal torture. Perhaps the most terrifying incident happened when he was just 16 years old. He stabbed a 6-year-old boy, later admitting he just wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone, and he simply walked away laughing. Add to this a deeply twisted, conflicted psychological relationship with his own mother, and the foundation for a ruthless predator was fully set.
The really crucial takeaway here is how he managed to live a total double life. On the surface, he maintained this wall of superficial normalcy. He held down a steady, honestly pretty boring job as a commercial truck painter for decades. He went to church, he was married multiple times, and was even a father. But right underneath that incredibly average, everyday exterior was a dark reality. A methodical, compulsive need to murder that he treated almost like a second job.
To maintain this bizarre double life, Ridgway experienced profound cognitive dissonance. Now, if you're not familiar, that's the psychological state of holding totally contradictory beliefs. For example, he claimed to actively despise the sex workers he compulsively sought out. He somehow rationalized his horrific crimes to himself by claiming he was cleaning up the streets, while simultaneously indulging in the exact behaviors he claimed to condemn. It's a textbook psychological defense mechanism.
Part 3. A methodical modus operandi. In the world of forensic psychology, killers are often categorized as either organized or disorganized. Well, Ridgway falls firmly into the organized category. While his IQ wasn't exceptionally high, he possessed incredible adaptive intelligence. He didn't just act on random impulse. He carefully selected highly vulnerable targets who wouldn't be immediately missed. He spread his crime scenes out over a massive area. He used a nice guy facade to lure victims into his truck, and his methods were chillingly precise to avoid leaving trace evidence behind.
Ridgway didn't experiment with novel murder methods because, as he put it in his own horrifying words, his method was working pretty good. When investigators asked why he strangled his victims, he coldly stated, "Choking is what I did, and I was pretty good at it." Now, this specific method did minimize blood and physical evidence, for sure, but it also tied into his deep-seated paraphilic need for ultimate intimate control over his victims' lives.
Part 4. Advice from Ted Bundy. So, by 1986, the task force was absolutely desperate. They had 40 victims officially linked to the case, and the trail was freezing cold. In a truly unprecedented move, lead investigator Dave Reichert flew to Florida's death row. His goal? To interview Ted Bundy. The rationale was definitely dark, but logical. It takes a serial killer to understand a serial killer. They were essentially hoping Bundy could profile the exact man they were hunting.
And amazingly, Bundy actually provided a chillingly accurate psychological insight. He told detectives that the Riverman, as he called him, wasn't just dumping the bodies and forgetting about them. Bundy predicted that the killer was actively returning to the grave sites to perform sexual acts on the corpses, and he advised the police to stake out fresh burial sites.
Bundy's theory was entirely spot on. In his later confessions, Ridgway admitted that he felt the bodies were his property and his possession. He engaged in severe necrophilia, frequently returning to the dump sites. He even mentioned being genuinely upset when police found the bodies, because he felt they were taking something of his. It's a literal textbook display of a killer's desperate need for post-mortem control.
Part 5. DNA cracks the case. Looking at how this all played out chronologically, there is a massive gap here. The murders peaked in the early 80s, and Ridgway was already a suspect, right? He actually passed a polygraph test because he was such an effective liar. In 1987, police went so far as to collect hair and saliva from him, but the DNA technology of the 1980s simply wasn't sophisticated enough to link his samples to the microscopic evidence found on the victims. They literally had to sit and wait 14 years for science to catch up to his crimes.
So, what finally changed in 2001? It was the advent of two major scientific breakthroughs: PCR and STR testing. In simple terms, PCR acts kind of like a molecular photocopier. It takes a tiny, highly degraded fragment of DNA and replicates it until there's enough to actually test. STR then analyzes those fragments to create a unique genetic fingerprint. These were the absolute game changers that allowed the state crime lab to take microscopic, decades-old traces of semen left on the victims and amplify them into a crystal clear profile.
And this was the exact moment the puzzle was finally solved. Forensic scientists analyzed a vaginal swab from one of the victims and matched it directly to that old saliva sample taken from Ridgway way back in 1987. The official documents note that the odds of it being anyone else in the world, excluding an identical twin, were virtually zero. The math was absolute. The Green River Killer was Gary Ridgway.
Part 6. The Killer's Dark Legacy. Ridgway was officially arrested on November 30th, 2001. To avoid the death penalty, he agreed to a plea deal, confessing to the sheer volume of his murders with a cold, almost robotic detachment that completely chilled investigators to the bone. And perhaps the absolute most disturbing moment of his sentencing was his unbelievably mild, inadequate apology for, quote, putting a scare in the community. I mean, that phrasing alone cemented his profile as an utterly remorseless psychopath, totally incapable of true human empathy.
So let's look at our final takeaways and see how this all builds our understanding of criminal psychology. The most vital lesson from this documentary explainer is that monsters don't always hide in the shadows, and they rarely look like raving lunatics from movies. Sometimes they're the unassuming, polite truck painters who wave to you on the street, sit next to you in church, and blend perfectly into the mundane fabric of daily life.
Which leaves us with this truly chilling final thought. Ridgway successfully fooled polygraphs, seasoned detectives, his friends, and even his own wives. If not for those brave, miraculous leaps in forensic science and DNA amplification, how many more organized, unremarkable killers would never have been caught? It's a stark reminder of exactly why the relentless pursuit of science and justice is so vital. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.